So speaking of that, he's wrote a bunch of books. One book that he's got here is Flooded. This is more of a science book for kids. What age group was it? Ninth and 10th grade. It's very scientific. I believe it could be used as a science book in like homeschool curriculums or whatever. So we got that book here. Got a few other books. It's child rearing book and some others. So if you have time, want to check that out, they're up here for purchase if you want them. Without further ado, Doc himself.
I was actually here presenting some of the stuff we're going to be looking at this week. I was here just a few months ago, but we decided it was a different enough audience on this particular week that we decided to go ahead and go for it again, cover a lot of it. And honestly, a lot of the material that I would have covered last fall, you probably need to hear a second time to really follow it. There's probably some truth to the whole doc thing and that being portrayed myself there at AP with those. We'll try to break this down a way where you can understand it. Be thinking about any kind of questions you might have as I cover this material this week. There may be time at the end of some of these sessions where we can have a little bit of question and answer time where I can give you at least my thoughts on kind of really the latest in creation science. I've been studying this creation science stuff very heavily over the last several years, getting into the field with the actual leading creation scientists in the world, and studying firsthand what happened in the flood, learning what the things are that we can know about the flood from a scientific perspective, not just the biblical side of things. And so some of the stuff I'll cover will probably cause you to have some questions. So be sure to jot those down where you can remember those. Even if I can't cover them tonight, I think we're a little bit more limited on our time tonight, but there may be some time later on this week to cover some materials. The progression that we're going to take this week is a little bit different from the progression the kids are going to be taking, but we're going to cover a lot of the same material, but just in a different way. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, we read there in Genesis 1:1, and that world that was created there, the Bible tells us several things we can learn about that original first world up to Genesis 3:6. And it was a very different world, and we don't have a lot of time to cover that this week. But after Genesis 3:6, you have the very first sin entering into the world, and that changes things. We have a different kind of world. There's a cursing of the world that occurs there that Genesis 3 talks about. So that's what I want to spend some time on in this session, is talking about what was this pre-flood world like? What was the world like as we enter on into the flood period? And a lot of the material and much, much more than what I'll be covering this week, I cover in this book, Flooded. And it's, again, I wrote it on more of a 9th and 10th grade level, which means really a lot of the adults actually like this because there's lots of pictures. It really breaks it down in a simple way. So I encourage you to take a look at that if you want to dig deeper and learn more about this subject. So be sure to check that out. I have a few copies here, and since I live in Montgomery, I'll be able to bring more this week if we need those. A good thematic verse for a study of the flood, I would say, is Psalm 111:2. The works of the Lord, the things that God has done are great, studied by all who have pleasure in them. This is basically an encouragement by God of doing science, to study the amazing things that God has done in the past. Romans 1:20, we can learn about God, the nature of God, by studying the things that are made. We can come to know about God and the things that he's done. In fact, forgetting what he has done, forgetting what he did in the flood, for example, would be a terrible mistake and has been a terrible mistake by humanity for millennia. How could we forget such an important historical event? And no doubt one reason would be a lack of teaching on this subject, a lack of research, a lack of study about this event and the kind of things we can learn. So studying the biblical creation model, the framework that we use to view the world around us and interpret its evidence, that is what we want to look at in this session. In the next one, So today we're going to talk about this, the fallen world, and we're going to talk about the flooded world, and we're going to talk about what the world was like right after the flood, what I call the frozen world, and then we're going to end with a session on more the apologetic side of things, the forgotten world. So what would life have been like after the first sin? Everything's changed, and can we know anything about that period? Well, obviously life would be very different for humanity than it would have been during the garden, and Scripture is almost completely silent about the events over those next 1,600 years. Moses essentially pushes fast forward, and we fly through the centuries up to the flood. The lifespan of the patriarchs from Adam to Noah are given in Genesis 5. And those Bible believers that want to accept an old earth idea, which is what conventional geology promotes, they sometimes might try to add gaps into these genealogies to try to accommodate an old earth. And in response to that, besides the fact that the dating methods that are used to try to promote an old earth are actually based on uniformitarian principles, which can easily be shown to be a terrible assumption in geology even today. And besides the fact that even if you were to squeeze in an enormous amount of time into the Bible here, when humans are already on the scene, that's not actually going to help you in geology, and I'll talk about that some later. But also the way that Moses states the genealogies here leaves no room for gaps. So over and over throughout the chapter, Moses, who's the author here of Genesis, uses this same formula. Person X lived A years and had person Y, and then X lived B years, and then the total life then of X was A plus B. And so with this formula, Moses nails down the chronology very tightly and allows no gaps in the pre-flood period. So Genesis 5 really provides one of the primary biblical evidences that the earth has to be relatively young and does not accommodate modern uniformitarian thinking. That, along with what we can learn from the Hebrew of Genesis 1, which doesn't allow for an inordinate amount of time there. So simple math shows us there were around 1,650 years from creation to the flood. In the New Testament, Jude verse 14 verifies that there are not gaps in these genealogies either, by calling Enoch the seventh from Adam, which lines up with the genealogies of Genesis 5 as well. And we can't know the exact precise number of years here because we know that, for example, Noah did not have Shem on Noah's birthday. He didn't live exactly X number of years and have Shem. There had to have been a rounding of a few days or months, and so there's potentially some rounding there. But we can be confident, assuming that the Hebrew text, as opposed to the Septuagint or the Samaritan Pentateuch, which are considered much more liberal, and not all of our modern translations are basically based on the Hebrew text, because it's when you dig into Hebrew and textual criticism, you see that's the more clearly, generally speaking, text that you're going to want to go with. So from that, we see there was about 1,650 years from creation to the flood. Notice then that Adam is actually alive to meet all of the patriarchs except for Noah. Methuselah actually dies the year of the flood. The average lifespan of these patriarchs, not counting Enoch, remember he was kind of the special exception, he was taken by God, but the others that actually, where it gives their entire lifespan, where they had a natural life, the average is about 912 years. So how in the world do we explain people living 912 years? Well, that's a clue about what the pre-flood world would have been like, a world which Peter, remember, described as having perished. We oftentimes just assume he's talking about the people, but it very much could be talking about the actual earth itself. This was a different place in which to live. How so? Well, first remember that the land itself, the geographic configuration of the earth, was apparently different. And that might be being alluded to in Genesis 1:9. God gathered all the water together, the text says, into one place, which seems to maybe be implying that the land was gathered separately. And you no doubt have heard of the idea of Pangea, the supercontinent that is thought to have existed in the past, that combined all of today's continents together into one. Though Alfred Wegener is often mentioned in association with this Pangea idea, it was actually a creationist, a biblical creationist by the name of Antonio Snyder Pellegrini, who was one of the very first to suggest the idea that the Earth's continents seemed to fit together like big puzzle pieces. And so this was the drawing he made back in 1858. This is several decades before Wegener was developing continental drift theory. So the idea that the continents drift around on the mantle was the thinking. And Snyder Pellegrini believed that the biblical flood may have been what broke this supercontinent up, what broke Pangea up. So continental drift has now been replaced with plate tectonics, and that's the idea that the entire crust of the Earth is actually broken up into big plates, including the ocean floor itself. It's also broken up, and they move around on top of the mantle. Now this puzzle piece configuration of the continents isn't the only evidence for Pangea. Today, scientists can use, for example, GPS readings and determine how fast the plates are moving and their heading, where they're heading. And from that movement, they can then extrapolate backwards, reversing their current trajectory to get an idea of the continent's locations in the past. And so plate tectonic theory is able to explain why, when the trajectory of the continents are reversed, why they converge and fit together like this big puzzle that Snyder Pellegrini drew. So plate tectonic theory explains why, when the puzzle is put together, you have matching rock layers and mountain belts that are on different continents today, separated by oceans. But when you put all of it back together into the supercontinent, these mountain belts continue going across the pieces onto the next piece. So plate tectonics explains why you even have matching fossil distributions that go across these puzzle pieces of the continents that are now again separated. And several other things. This theory has great explanatory power, but how would Pangea fit with the Bible when the rate of motion that we see of these plates today is on the order of centimeters per year? It's basically as fast as your fingernails grow. Well, so if it's going to take eons for these continents to get to their current position, how do you explain that from a biblical perspective? Well, as is always the case, modern naturalistic thinking is based on bad underlying assumptions that they start with. In this case, uniformitarianism. The idea that whatever you see going on today must have always gone on in the same way it does today without really any deviation from that. So we don't have global floods today, so you assume that never happened in the past. All rates that we see today must have always been that way in the past. So any kind of catastrophic event which we can't witness today, you assume that just didn't happen under uniformitarianism. So if the continents are moving apart today on the order of centimeters per year, then they've always moved that slowly, and therefore it would have taken eons for the continents to then fit together into this big puzzle piece. Well, the Bible can be known to be inspired because it has supernatural characteristics. It has qualities that humans could not have produced. They are divine characteristics, and we could do an entire session on that. So because the Bible is inspired, we know it is a true account of history, which means that uniformitarianism is false because the flood happened. Catastrophism is true. Okay, so the geologic effects of any kind of major global catastrophe has to be considered if it could have played a role in how we interpret geologic features today. And so in our next session, we'll see how the flood would have affected the rate of the Earth's plates, and it was significant. And so our objective, though, at this point is we're going to consider the implications of the scientific evidence with regard to what we can learn about the pre-flood world based on this kind of information. And what we see is that the Earth was, in fact, very different. In fact, there's evidence that there was a supercontinent before Pangea. And so when we piece Pangea back together, we find that the Appalachian Mountains of the eastern United States which is actually what I was studying over the last month. I was studying caves up in that direction. These mountains continue on into Europe and become the Caledonian Mountains whenever you piece Pangaea back together. You've got this mountain belt that continues going. Well, what's the implications of that? So when we examine the nature of the rock layers that are found in those mountains, we find that these mountains have layers in them that were laid down in the flood before they were buckled to form the mountain chain we see today. That means that the Appalachians were not formed until during the flood. And so when we understand that mountains form due to these big tectonic plates moving around and smashing into each other, it suggests that there was a pre-flood continental configuration that converged to form Pangaea during the flood, and that's when the Appalachian Mountains were made. And so this supercontinent we sometimes call Rodinia. So also suggested by the fact that mountains form as tectonic plates smash into each other. One of the things that we'll find as we study the flood is that the bulk of the Earth's mountains were in fact likely formed during the flood. So what does that suggest about the pre-flood Earth? Well, it was likely much flatter than today, perhaps more rolling hills and plains. And so regardless, we can't know much about what the original Earth looked like beyond a few scientific clues, because the actual remnants of those continents are very small and incomplete. God completely destroyed that world in the flood. Much of it was eroded away or actually subducted down into the mantle, and we'll talk about that some later as well. So when we look up from the Earth itself, we look up from the geography and the geology, and we start thinking about now life itself. What were living things like on the planet before the flood? Well, how in the world can we know what life was like before the flood? And to answer that question, we need to turn to the fossil record, which I want to spend a lot of time on in this session. I didn't get to talk about this a lot last fall when I was here, but this is such an important, to study the fossil record gives you so much great information about what that pre-flood world was like as God originally made it. So what can we learn about the pre-flood world from the fossil record? And from an apologetic standpoint, does the fossil record in fact support creation or evolution? You know, evolutionists have long argued, hey, this is great evidence that we're right and creationists are wrong. So does the fossil record in fact disprove creation and the flood? That's what I want to look at. So, for example, notice this chart. Ran across this chart a few years ago. You know, when I was in junior high and high school back in the 90s, I was very intimidated by the fossil record. I mean, this was said to support evolution, and I just didn't know anything about it, and I wasn't hearing much pushback from Christians. It was more just kind of a blind faith kind of idea. And so the fossil record was a big unanswered question in my mind as a scientific, rational type person. So the bits and pieces of information that I was hearing in response to the claims of evolutionists seemed really insufficient to answer the question, or at least possibly insufficient, because they seemed, you know, the arguments that I was hearing seemed like they could be superficial arguments for all I knew. Arguments for which deeper study would reveal how weak they are. And I just didn't know what to do with the fossil record. Now, amazingly, after several years of studying the fossil record in the Geologic Column, literally digging in the fossil record in some cases, I've actually found the fossil record is really one of the strongest arguments against evolutionary theory and for biblical creation and the flood. So in addition to the abbreviated material I have on this in the flooded book, I also have an article on this subject on our website, which we've turned into a track as well, and you can see this article for free on our website. And I encourage you to take a look at that. So obviously, in order to study the fossil record, we're going to need to deal with some scientific matters as they relate to Scripture. And so I want to start by defining some terms that I'm going to be using, which, if I didn't explain these, might make it a little bit difficult for you to understand what I'm talking about. Paleontology, you've surely heard of this term. This is the scientific discipline that involves studying fossils. And so we first need to know what in the world a fossil is. A fossil is the leftovers of any kind of living thing that is typically preserved as rock or in rocks. And so bones, trees, trunks, insects, plants, even footprints. And so it's not the original bone or tree, generally speaking, but instead it is the shape of it preserved like an imprint. A cast or a mold is the kind of word you would probably use to make sense of this. So an empty impression of a bone or a tree trunk might be left. That is what we call a mold fossil. And if that empty impression is filled with sediment and it turns to stone, then it becomes what we call a cast fossil. And some fossils are called body fossils. This is where you have the actual body part of, say, like a bone is actually preserved as a cast or mold. And some fossils are what we call trace fossils, where, say, the tracks or the footprints or activity of an organism is actually preserved as a fossil. So you think footprints, you think bite marks, those can sometimes be preserved. Burrows from creatures burrowing under the ground, and also dung is a big one we find. Now the fossil record then is all of the fossils that have been preserved in the rock layers of the earth. That's what we call the fossil record. So how do fossils form? Conventional thinking today, which is more the evolutionary mindset, in geology, it holds to the assumption of uniformitarianism, which I've already used that term some. The idea that the present is the key to understanding the past. Whatever geologic processes you see going on today, volcanoes forming, canyons eroding, mud and sediment being deposited, piling up, mountains growing, continents moving, whatever geologic processes you see going on today, you assume they've always gone on that same way in the past. So if something isn't happening today, uniformitarianism assumes it never happened. The flood, supernatural creation, that doesn't work with uniformitarian thinking. Those don't happen today, and so it's assumed that they never happened, according to conventional geologic thinking. Now, Bible believers would say that the present isn't the key to understanding the past, but in the words of Dr. Andrew Snelling, the past is actually the key to understanding the present. And so sudden, short-lived, potentially worldwide impacting catastrophic events in the past have to be considered if they can affect how we interpret geology around us. And so what is termed catastrophism in geology. So catastrophism is definitely the biblical approach to geology. Notice, for example, what 2 Peter 3:3-6 says, knowing this first, that scoffers will come in the last days. I run into a lot of those in my studies, walking according to their own lust and saying, where's the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. Whatever we see going on today, that's the way it's always been. For this they willfully forget that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of water and in the world, water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. So Peter, notice, highlights the fact that since miraculous activity on God's part would become scarce in the future, some will forget about God's amazing works in the past and start having a uniformitarian mindset. The things happening today have always gone on that way throughout time. The present is the key to the past. Enormous catastrophic events caused by an alleged God, that never happened. And Peter responds by highlighting the greatest catastrophic event that God ever worked, the flood. Since the flood happened, uniformitarianism will not be the correct approach to understand what is going on the earth geologically when we're looking at any kind of things that formed in the past. Well, so which approach is right? Amazingly, the mere existence of the fossil record is powerful testimony of catastrophic activity, because catastrophic conditions are necessary in order for something to fossilize. Think about this. What happens to an animal when it dies today? Okay, so think of roadkill, for example. What happens to it? Does it turn into a fossil? No. It decays. It's eaten by insects and scavengers. It doesn't fossilize. Think about footprints that you make in the mud or sand. What happens to them? They're washed away by rain, or they're wiped away by wind or water. They don't turn into trace fossils. So how do fossils form? Well, let's think about a cast fossil. This is where a bone has become rock through a process we call permineralization. In order for that to happen, a creature or bone has to be quickly buried by something like mud or lava or tar. It has to be buried deep enough and thoroughly enough so that it's protected from most water, from oxygen, from scavengers, from microorganisms that are going to break it down. The fleshy parts of the organism then decay and dissolve over time, but the harder parts like bone and teeth decay more slowly. In fact, they decay slowly enough that as the bone decays and dissolves and water seeps down through the ground and washes it away, the tiny spaces that are left are then filled with the minerals that are in the water. And so the bone is gradually replaced by minerals, and a copy of the bone shape is then made and left in place of the original bone, eventually to be uncovered by erosion or excavation. And so notice, catastrophic burial, rapid burial by a lot of material, burying something completely and burying it deeply is necessary to fossilize something. And the fossil record itself is evidence of major catastrophism in the past, contrary to the idea that slow and gradual uniform processes form the earth over millions of years. Now, scientists used to argue that the fossilization process takes thousands or millions of years to accomplish. But empirical evidence has disproved that assumption over the last few decades. Studies, for example, have shown that the rate of petrification can be significantly altered when you have catastrophic conditions like volcanic eruptions, whenever you have things like that happening. So just as a couple of examples of studies from the last couple of decades. In 2004, 5 Japanese scientists published their research on petrification through in a rapid petrification. They published it in their secular journal, Sedimentary Geology, and they were studying mineral-rich acidic water from the explosion crater of the Tateyama volcano in central Japan. So water runs over the edge of this volcano as a waterfall, and some wood had fallen in the path of this mineral-rich water, and the wood petrified, they found, within 36 years. And so the scientists decided to conduct further experiments and found that silica petrification could occur in even 7 years. And also in 2004, a paper was published on the rapid silicification of plants at Yellowstone Park. Within 11 months, plants were already found to have had enough silicification that the plant tissues were stabilized against collapse and the entire plant structure was replicated. So again, catastrophic conditions make fossils, and it can make them fast. And the flood would have provided the perfect setting for that. So mudslides, lava flows would have been abundant, and I see powerful evidence of that in my work out in Wyoming when I was studying seismites out there. Sediment accumulation would have been accelerated, allowing for thicker and quicker, deeper deposits, and permineralization would have been rapid. Now, in the Bill Nye Kenham debate back in 2014, Bill Nye, the pseudoscience guy, squared off against creationist Kenham, who's the CEO of Answers in Genesis, and they developed the Ark Encounter and the Creation Museum in northern Kentucky, which I highly recommend if you haven't seen that. And one of the points that Bill Nye brought up several times had to do with the idea of predictions in science. Now, here's what he said. He said, so far, Mr. Ham, in his worldview, the creation model does not have this capability. It cannot make predictions and show results. The big thing I want from you, Mr. Ham, is can you come up with something that you can predict? Do you have a creation model that predicts something that will happen in nature? So he's saying that basically creationism is not even science. Now, he's not talking about predictive prophecy, like what prophets can do, where they're recording events that would happen in the future. He's talking about what we call scientific predictions. And so let's say that I develop a theory and I say, I believe that there's an invisible force like a magnet and it sucks smaller masses toward the center of larger masses, and I'm going to call my theory gravity. Okay, so if my theory is a valid scientific theory, I should be able to make predictions based on my theory that can either be verified, which adds support for my theory, or falsified because my predictions didn't come true and therefore disproving at least that form of the theory. And so according to Bill Nye, creationists can't do that. We can't do legitimate science with actual predictions. And I have an article on our website where I give just 30 very quick predictions based on the Bible and the biblical flood that have been verified upon examination of the scientific evidence. And one area where creation scientists have actually provided powerful, verified scientific predictions is in reference to the fossil record. And at the same time, the fossil record effectively falsifies evolutionary theory because several things that should be found in the fossil record, if evolution is true, are not found. And so let's take a look at some of that powerful evidence now. First of all, evolution in the fossil record. What would we predict to find in the fossil record if evolution, as Charles Darwin defined it, were true? Most evolutionists argue that the very first living creatures on the earth sprang to life on the earth 3.5 to 4 billion years ago, and that life would have been very simple single-celled organisms, and then all species, all life ultimately evolved from that lower life. And so if naturalism and evolution are true, when you look at the general characteristics of the fossil record, you'd expect to see at the very bottom of the fossil record, representing the very beginning of life on earth, you should see simple single-celled organisms, very simple, no complexity. And in the rocks above them, slightly more complex creatures that they evolved into. And above them, slightly more complex creatures and so forth. And in between each of those species, you'd expect to find billions upon billions of fossils from creatures that we call transitional forms or transitional species. Species transitioning into new species, connecting the lower species in the fossil record with the next species above it that emerges. And so there'd be billions of transitional fossils between each of these species progressions. Fossils that form a chain of gradually evolving species up through the rock layers, eventually leading to humans. Now I say billions because if there are roughly 11 million species on the planet today, as some estimates say, not to mention the multiplied millions of species that evolutionists believe existed in the past but went extinct, each one of those species had to evolve from a different former species. And so there should be fossils of intermediate species between the already known distinct species that we know about and the next species. And since evolutionists believe species generally live on the earth, each one of them is thought to live on the earth for 1 to 11 million years each before going extinct. Each one of those billions of species should almost certainly be represented by multiple fossils in the fossil record. So in all, billions of transitional forms should in fact exist. Another prediction, evolution would predict that all life is related, having evolved from previous evolutionary ancestors. From that idea comes our tree diagrams, like the original one that Darwin sketched in 1837 in one of his notebooks, and he included it in depth in The Origin of Species in 1859. So the evolutionary model would predict that all life is related, however distantly, because it all evolved from the same single-celled organism. It all belongs on the same big tree, this big evolutionary tree. Evolution would also predict diversity to evolve before we see species disparity. I want to explain what I mean by that. In other words, you should see a single body type show up and then varieties of that. Diversity. That should be found lower in the fossil record. And then over time, moving up through the record, you would expect other completely new kinds of body types to eventually show up. That's what we call disparity. So again, looking at the evolutionary tree of life, this would be the idea that the twigs should show up on the branches before completely new branches arrive. That's what you'd expect. Another prediction, eventual extinction of a species would be virtually guaranteed because species would be evolving into something supposedly better. And so the previous less fit species should be pushed out of the way in favor of the new, better species. And so the older species should go extinct over time. Survival of the fittest is the term, right? You wouldn't, however, expect simultaneous worldwide mass extinction. Why? Well, because mass extinction would mean that major catastrophes affected the Earth in the past, catastrophism. But evolution is based on uniformitarian thinking. That goes hand in hand with the geology side of things. So the belief, again, that whatever we see happening today has always happened throughout time. So since we don't see major mass extinction causing catastrophes today, then you wouldn't predict those to happen in the fossil record either. Related to the fossil record, we have the geologic column, and so the rock layers in which are found all the fossils. So if evolution and naturalism are true, you would expect localized sedimentation and rock layers and localized erosion. Why? Well, because that's what you see happening today. We don't see the same type of sediment making a sheet across an entire planet at one time. Instead, you see certain types of sediment being deposited in some areas and totally different kinds of sediment elsewhere. And similarly, we don't see worldwide erosion surfaces. Today, we see localized erosion, where, say, a flood might cause a lot of erosion in just one city, but not over here in this other city. You might have wind causing a sand dune to form over here in this area, but not over here. And glaciers might cause erosion at the poles, but obviously not everywhere across the whole planet. Since evolutionists argue that evolution took millions of years to turn one type of creature into another, then the rock layers in which are found the fossils should show evidence of a lot of time passing between them. Okay, so for example, when we look at normal terrain today, we see rolling hills and lakes and valleys that are formed as erosion occurred. We don't see perfectly flat terrain. And so if uniformitarianism is true, all things have gone on geologically as they do today, and so the surface area today became stone over time, then you would expect dips and plunges, hills and valleys, not straight horizontal rock layers. You shouldn't see that. And in fact, if the rock layers are being slowly formed from sediment being deposited and accumulating over time, we wouldn't even see distinct thin layering of rocks. Why? Well, because of what is called bioturbation. So whenever your kid goes outside and digs a couple of feet in the background, does he find distinct thin horizontal layers? No, it's one big pile of material, in large part due to bioturbation. This is where all the soil and sediment are constantly being reworked by plants, animals that burrow and eat sediment and excrete sediment. And so obviously if there aren't major catastrophic events occurring, but instead layers are being slowly, uniformly deposited and formed over millions of years, there would be plenty of time for bioturbation to happen, as it does today, which would totally destroy sediment layering. Right? So from a uniformitarian perspective, you shouldn't see distinct layers. So when we look at the predictions now that we would make on our side, the biblical creation predictions, we'd essentially make the opposite predictions. First of all, since fossils form from cataclysmic activity, the flood provided the perfect conditions for fossilization. So most fossils, we would say, were probably likely formed as a result of the flood. That's when the bulk of the catastrophism is going on. The pre-flood rock layers would likely not reveal much fossilization because much of the catastrophic activity that we see today that actually forms fossils, volcanic activity, flooding, hurricanes, these are a result of what actually happened in the flood. So you're not going to see much in the pre-flood rock layers of fossils. But then starting at the flood layers, you'd expect to see evidence of worldwide catastrophic burial. And in those layers, you'd expect an explosion of already fully formed creatures without any evolutionary history because they didn't evolve. They're already fully formed, they were created, and so there's no transitional forms. That's what you'd expect. We'd expect both simple and complex creatures immediately, right off the bat at the bottom. So a snapshot of the death that happened during the flood. This is not evolution from simple to from simple single-celled organisms, but this is a snapshot of everything that was around at that point. Now, while evolution would predict, remember, diversity before disparity, the creation model would expect the opposite. God created representatives of distinct kinds of creatures on the planet, and representatives from each kind were then brought on the ark. And from those original proto-species, which would have been very distinct from each other, would have come a lot of variety within those kinds over time. So instead of a single evolutionary tree, creationists would argue that creatures should fit more into an orchard, starting with very distinct original kinds, and then so disparity, and then ending with diversity within those kinds. So disparity before diversity. And so when a species' fossils appear in the fossil record, you'd expect the fossils to then change very little in the rocks above them. They're only diversity you'll see within the group, because species don't evolve into completely new types of creatures. They just diversify into varieties of the same basic type of creature. Since creationists would say most of the fossil record was formed in the flood, you'd expect the flood layers to likely, by and large, reflect the progression of the flood. And the implication of that concept is where we can get a lot of information about the pre-flood world. More on that later. But since, according to Genesis 7:11, the flood apparently began in the ocean and then moved towards the land, the progression of the fossil record from bottom to top, at least again in the flood rock layers, we'd expect that to reflect the flood's progression, starting in the seafloor, moving upward to the ocean-dwelling creatures, and then to the coastlines, and then finally to the land. But since we're talking about land covering global flood action, where water and sediment is being pushed onto the land from the oceans, you would expect marine creature fossils, after they first appear, to be found across the planet through the rest of the flood layers above them, not merely sequestered to the sea, but mixed in with land creatures, even though they're the marine creatures. That's a strange prediction from an evolutionary perspective, but one we should expect to find. And as with evolution, creationists would also expect extinctions, because if nothing else, humans might tend to be unwise and wipe out certain species, but unlike evolution, mass extinction would make sense from a creationist perspective, because the earth was so drastically altered by the flood, then many species might no longer be well suited to the earth's post-flood environment. And so they would appear in the fossil record, but then die out after the flood due to maybe the ice age, due to hunting, due to continued catastrophic conditions after the flood, which we'll talk about some later. And more specific to the geologic column, which again directly applies to the fossil record, unlike the evolutionary predictions, we would predict that rock layers that were being deposited by the flood, okay, roughly what we say that the Paleozoic through the Mesozoic rock layers, would reveal, we would expect, worldwide deposition of sediment across the whole planet, rather than just localized deposition like you see today. It should be different in the flood layers. Also, unlike the evolutionary prediction, we would expect very little evidence of time between rock layers, because sediment was being deposited rapidly during the flood, and so you'd expect lots of horizontal, razor-sharp, distinct layers, and little evidence of bioturbation from animals burrowing and mixing up the layers, because they were killed and buried before they had time to do that. And so again, this would lead to distinct, pristine layering, unlike what you see today. While such layering would be the norm, you would expect some exceptions to the rule. There may be evidence of time between the deposition of layers here and there, but not reflecting the passing of thousands of years even, but likely hours in which the flood waters are ebbing and flowing as they're rising due to, for example, the tide and tectonic plate subduction processes going on. And so we have our predictions, which if we've made them fairly and accurately, can add support for a theory or falsify it. Now, what does the fossil record actually reveal? Does it support the evolutionary perspective or creation? Does it falsify the Bible? Well, there's lots we could say on this subject, but let's summarize it with 3 big points. Evolutionary paleontologists, this is not creationists, have identified 3 sweeping general characteristics of the fossil record: abrupt appearance, stasis, and extinction. And each of these characteristics perfectly match creationist predictions and undeniably falsify evolution, effectively refuting evolution. And so no wonder the late Harvard paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould, perhaps the leading paleontologist of the 20th century, he called the evolutionist fossil record dilemma an uncomfortable paradox. How so? Well, the first major sweeping characteristic of the fossil record that is highlighted again even by the evolutionists like Stephen Jay Gould himself is labeled abrupt appearance. What they mean by abrupt appearance is that when a new species appears in the fossil record, it shows up on the scene abruptly, fully formed, without any clear evolutionary ancestors below it in the record. There's no evidence of evolutionary history. And perhaps the most obvious example of abrupt appearance is what they call the Cambrian Explosion, which, by the way, I was just at up in D.C. at the National Museum of Natural History. They still totally acknowledge this. This totally destroys the evolutionary predictions. In the Cambrian rock layers, which is basically the beginning of the fossil record to all intents and purposes, there's an explosion of life. The immediate appearance of many totally different kinds of life, disparity. Some species are simple and some aren't, and they don't have any evolutionary history. They just abruptly appear. Reporting on the research of the University of Texas at Austin, here's what UT News reported. This rapid diversification, known as the Cambrian Explosion, puzzled Charles Darwin and remains one of the biggest questions in animal evolution to this day. Very few fossils exist of organisms that could be the pre-Cambrian ancestors, we'd say pre-flood, of bilateral animals, and even those are highly controversial. American Scientist magazine acknowledged, as Darwin noted in The Origin of Species, the abrupt emergence of arthropods in the fossil record during the Cambrian presents a problem for evolutionary biology. There are no obvious simpler or intermediate forms, either living or in the fossil record, that show convincingly how modern arthropods evolved from worm-like ancestors. Consequently, there's been a wealth of speculation and contention. Gould admitted this: the Cambrian Explosion was the most remarkable and puzzling event in the history of life. In fact, he considered the Cambrian Explosion so puzzling and such a problem for evolution that, according to Kurt Wise, who's a creation paleontologist that studied under Stephen Jay Gould at Harvard, Gould spent the bulk of his life trying to find a way to explain the Cambrian Explosion to fix this dilemma for evolution, and he died never having found one, even though he was the leading mind. Famous evolutionary biologist of Oxford University, Richard Dawkins, described the Cambrian Explosion this way: the Cambrian strata of rocks, vintage about 600 million years, are the oldest in which we find most of the major invertebrate groups, and we find many of them already in an advanced state of evolution. They're already complex. The very first time they appear, it is as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. Needless to say, this appearance of sudden planting has delighted creationists. So advanced state of evolution, the first time they appear, no evolutionary history. Now, why would that delight creationists? Well, because it's exactly what we predict to be the case if the flood happened. I mean, to the creation geologists, the Cambrian strata record the beginning stages of the flood. Okay, the fossil record doesn't disprove creation, it adds powerful testimony to the truth of creation and the flood, that the Bible's right and evolution is false. Long ago, the late famous paleontologist of Columbia University, the American Museum of Natural History and the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard, George Gaylord Simpson, he said, most new species, genera, and families, in nearly all categories above the level of families, right, so disparity, appear in the record suddenly and are not led up to by known, gradual, completely transitional sequences. So the Cambrian Explosion is an acknowledged problem for evolutionary theory, a falsified prediction. And yet the abrupt appearance of fully formed and functional species is an obvious, pervasive trait of the entire fossil record, from beginning to end. This isn't just, we're not just cherry picking. No, this, they say, is pervasive across the entire fossil record. Abrupt appearances characterizes the entire fossil record, but the abrupt appearance of living organisms in the fossil record isn't even the extent of the problem. Not only are the species of the fossil record fully formed and functional from the beginning of the record, but they are also complex whenever they appear. The trilobite, for example, is characteristic of the Cambrian strata at the very base of the fossil record. And this is a creature that is equipped with an extremely complex vision system using aplanatic lenses that are more complex even than the human eye, which is equipped with a single refractive lens. This makes it where these guys can actually see on the bottom of the ocean. And again, the National Museum of Natural History has a whole display talking about how awesome and amazing and complex these creatures are, and yet they show up at the very base of the fossil record, even though there's clear evidence of powerful design. The fossil record provides no evidence for the evolution of the trilobite, and yet its complexity is stunning. And it is found at the base of the record where species should be simple. Complexity at the very beginning of the fossil record is a falsification of a fundamental evolutionary prediction. But once again, it coincides exactly with what we would predict if creation and the flood are true. And recall also that evolution would predict that diversity should precede disparity in the fossil record. So in other words, varieties of a single body type, diversity, should be found in the fossil record at the base, and then over time, moving up through the record, other totally different body types would eventually emerge, disparity, if evolution is true. And so again, we call to mind the evolutionary tree of life as compared to the biblical orchard. Well, the fossil record, once again, supports the creationist contention. So looking broadly at all species and thinking about classification of species, biologists have pinpointed a few dozen distinct phyla. Okay, this is the level of organization that is used to group all organisms based on their just basic body plans. Okay, just a few dozen of these. There are 27 of those distinct phyla represented in the fossil record, 27 distinct body plans. And of those 27 phyla, roughly 20 appear abruptly at the base of the fossil record during the Cambrian Explosion with no evolutionary ancestors below them. So immense disparity. And variety, that is the species diversity within those phyla, doesn't show up until higher in the fossil record, just as biblical creation would predict. Disparity before diversity. So abrupt appearance of fully formed and functional complex organisms with immense disparity is a sweeping characteristic of the fossil record. Again, this isn't just a little anomaly. This is a general trait of the fossil record. And that truth is severely problematic for evolution, but it is exactly what would be expected if biblical creation and the flood are true. Okay, sweeping characteristic number 2 of the fossil record, according to evolutionists themselves, is stasis. Stasis in the fossil record refers to the observation that after creatures appear in the fossil record, they remain virtually the same throughout their tenure in the rock layers above them. And so while Darwinian evolution would predict a gradual change of species over millions of years, the fossil record doesn't reflect that prediction. Transitional fossils that link one species to a different species, they don't exist. And I'm not saying that fossils aren't found from time to time that are immediately claimed to be transitional forms, or examples that have become ensconced in textbooks like Tectonic and Archaeopteryx and Pakicetus and the Australopithecines. The problem is that they are all, without exception, debatable and are heavily debated and contested even among the evolutionists themselves. Since the fossil finds are generally fragmentary, often they fall within the range of variety that would be found within already established species, rather than being representative of a totally new species that is transitioning into something else. And because other fossil finds will then come about in time, which almost inevitably disprove the first interpretation of that fossil from an evolutionary standpoint. And so no wonder Gould admitted that evolutionists have no direct evidence for smooth transitions. Darwinian evolution predicts gradual, smooth transitions from species to species, which should be documented through transitional forms, missing links, but the fossil record doesn't verify that prediction, it actually falsifies it. Notice what he admitted. All paleontologists know that the fossil record contains precious little in the way of intermediate forms. Transitions between major groups are characteristically abrupt. So precious little intermediate forms, and even those are heavily debated among evolutionists as to whether or not they really are transitional forms. No, abruptness characterizes the fossil record, not transition, not evolution, distinct creatures when they show up. And they remain the same throughout their tenure in the fossil record, other than mere varieties of the same. Writing in Paleobiology, he explained in apparent exasperation. He says, the absence of fossil evidence for intermediary stages between major transitions in organic design, right? So the absence of intermediate forms connecting major groups. Indeed, our inability, even in our imagination, to construct functional intermediates, just to make something up that we think should look like this, has been a persistent and nagging problem for gradualistic accounts of evolution. So an absence of fossilized species that should provide a bridge between major transitions, the distinct types of creatures, we can't even construct these in our imaginations, what they should look like. So this is a major problem that has nagged evolutionists with persistence, he says. The problem isn't letting up. It's not getting better for the evolutionary worldview. This is a telling quote. He said, the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. And so first of all, transitional forms, again, are extremely rare, and again, even those are controversial among evolutionists themselves, and that problem is a trade secret of paleontology. In other words, you don't tend to know about that problem unless you happen to be an evolutionary paleontologist, and few are. They don't broadcast that problem loudly in the news and so forth and in textbooks, because I think it would highlight the fact that evolution really is a house of cards. The evidence doesn't support it. So he goes on, the evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of the fossils. In other words, think about the evolutionary tree of life. The actual fossil evidence only tells you what's at the tips of the branches and the nodes between the branches, not any of the species between those distinct species. There are no proven transitional forms that connect the tips of the branches to the nodes. Instead, there are simple, distinct types of creatures everywhere throughout the record, with no evidence that they came from each other. And yet, in spite of the evidence, they believe firmly in evolution anyway, proving themselves to have a blind faith in evolution, willing to draw conclusions that are not warranted by the evidence, which is the definition of being irrational. So notice what he says. We don't have the fossils to connect the tips, the fossils at the tips and the nodes, he says. And yet we're going to go ahead and believe in it anyway. Blind faith, no evidence for evolution, belief in it anyway, a rejection of the actual evidence. The actual evidence in the fossil record is stasis. Fossils appear in the fossil record, and then the fossils of that species remain the same throughout their tenure in the fossil record. Recall that the phylum is higher up the chain in the categorization of species. This represents the various groups of creatures that share the same basic body plan, okay? And obviously evolution requires that there be evolution between phyla. I mean, one type of body plan has to be able to evolve into another type of body plan in order for there to be so many body plans now on the planet that weren't there at the beginning, right? But notice what evolutionary paleontologist Stephen Stanley said. He said, the known fossil record fails to document a single example of phyletic evolution, where you have evolution of a new phylum, accomplishing a major morphological transition, and hence offers no evidence that the gradualistic model can be valid. There's not a single example of evolution between phyla, and so there's no evidence for gradualistic evolution, which is the kind of evolution that is accepted by the evolutionary community, which is Darwinian. Evolutionary anthropologist and emeritus professor at the University of Oxford, Robert Barnes, He acknowledged that the fossil record tells us almost nothing about the evolutionary origin of phyla and classes. Intermediate forms are non-existent, undiscovered, or not recognized. You'd think it wouldn't be so hard to find these if evolution is true. Evolutionary biologists James Valentine and Douglas Irwin wrote, "If ever we were to expect to find ancestors to or intermediates between higher taxa, it'd be in the rocks of the late Precambrian to Ordovician times," right? So the Cambrian strata, when the bulk of the world's higher animal taxa evolved. Yet transitional alliances are unknown or unconfirmed for any of the phyla or classes appearing then. And so clear is the lack of evidence of evolutionary transition in the fossil record that evolutionary zoologist of Oxford, Mark Ridley, he went so far as to say, no real evolutionist, whether gradualistic or punctuationist, uses the fossil record as evidence in favor of the theory of evolution as opposed to special creation. Why? Well, because leading evolutionists, the ones in the know that the fossil record doesn't support evolution. It supports creation. So if you know your stuff, you can't use the fossil record in a debate. That's not going to be a good idea. The lack of transitional fossils, this issue, this isn't a new problem. It's been around from the beginning of Darwinian evolution, but ignored. Charles Darwin saw the problem even back in the 1800s when he was developing his theory in The Origin of Species. He said the number of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed must be truly enormous. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. And notice, this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be argued against this theory. The explanation lies, I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geological record. All right, so in other words, he recognizes this is a major argument that could be used, and yet he blindly believes it anyway. He just blindly believes, the geologic record is just incomplete. Just give us some time, we need to dig around a little bit more, and we'll find the evidence we need to substantiate this. Well, if his theory is true, there should be transitional forms. They would be predicted to exist, but they don't. It falsifies his theory before it should have even gotten off the ground. The theory should have been scrapped right then, but it wasn't. Why? That's the question. Well, it wasn't the evidence. He admitted the evidence didn't support his theory on that point. Well, with many, as it was with Darwin himself, it was because biblical creation wasn't a palatable option to them. It didn't matter what the evidence says, so they latched on evolution. They didn't want God in the picture. Nothing's really changed since creation, has it? I mean, that's the way man has always been. Colin Patterson literally wrote the textbook on evolution. He was the paleontologist who served as the editor of the professional journal published by the British Museum of Natural History in London. In response to a letter that came into him asking why he didn't include examples of transitional fossils in his book on evolution, he responded and said, "I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. Yet Gould and the American Museum people are hard to contradict when they say there are no transitional fossils. I'll lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument." That's pretty telling. And such problems are surely why he said in a lecture that he presented at the American Museum of Natural History, "One morning I woke up and something had happened in the night, and it struck me that I had been working on this stuff, evolution, for 20 years, and there was not one thing I knew about it. That's quite a shock to learn that one can be misled so long. Either there's something wrong with me, or there was something wrong with evolutionary theory." He didn't know anything about evolution. Nothing has been proved. His belief in evolution remains in the realm of blind faith, not a logical conclusion from the actual evidence. Notable is the fact that when paleontologists uncover a fossil that they hope will pass as a legitimate transitional form, not only is that fossil still always controversial, but the champion fossil is inevitably from a vertebrate organism. Okay, so a creature with a backbone. Where are the invertebrate transitional forms? Vertebrate fossils comprise roughly 0.0125% of the fossil record. That's way less than 1%, the creatures with a backbone. So if this graduated cylinder represents the fossil record, vertebrate fossils would be represented by about one droplet in the cylinder. They're virtually irrelevant in telling us whether or not evolution happened, if you're going to use the fossil record. Since well over 99.9% of the fossil record is made up of invertebrate fossils, well, since they fossilize so much more easy, you would expect that if evolution happened, transitional fossils should be all over the place among the invertebrates, right? It should prove it. But rarely, if ever, do evolutionists even claim to find alleged invertebrate transitional forms. So species evolve in the manner described by mainstream evolutionists. That number one, transitional forms should not be difficult to find. And number two, they should be invertebrates most of the time. Neither of those predictions hold true. Further verification that stasis reflects the fossil record comes in the form of what Darwin termed living fossils. Countless times over the years, evolutionists have discovered fossils in strata that are laid down, they would say, millions of years ago, according to the evolutionary timeline, that were thought to be extinct, presumably from having evolved into something else, with the previous form being pushed out, being selected against. And so they don't show up all of a sudden in all these strata. So according to evolution, species are the result of descent with modification from other species. So it'd be virtually inconceivable. It'd be virtually inconceivable that a species would remain essentially the same after millions of years. I mean, after all, according to evolution, evolution happens, right? So living fossils, though, have been discovered many times over the years. Living fossils are species thought to have lived millions of years ago and are presumably gone extinct, that have been discovered alive today in modern times. And yet they are virtually the same as their fossil counterpart. They didn't evolve into something else over those intervening supposed billions of years. And so here's just a handful of those. Are we to believe that evolution happens when we find coelacanths today and they look exactly like their fossil counterpart that was thought to have gone extinct 300 to 400 million years ago? Or the modern horseshoe crab that matches its fossil counterpart that's supposed to be over 400 million years old? And so once again, the predictions of evolutionary paradigm fall woefully short when you ignore the claims of evolutionists and look at the actual evidence. Stasis is a verified prediction of the creation model, not the evolutionary paradigm. So a lack of transitional fossils, especially among the invertebrates, along with the prevalence of living fossils, supports creation, not evolution. All right, sweeping characteristic number 3. Recall that if evolution happens, if it were true, you'd expect extinctions. That's going to be mandatory. Species are supposed to evolve, and the more fit variation should force the less fit varieties to die out. And if they don't die out, then they must not have been less fit. So why did they need to evolve to something else in the first place? So living fossils are powerful testimony to the fact that the evolutionary paradigm doesn't fit the evidence. But here's another evidence. It comes in the form of mass extinctions. So while extinctions are predicted by evolution, mass extinctions, where you have high percentages of the Earth's species being wiped out, that doesn't fit, because that suggests phenomena that are so catastrophic that the entire world had to have been affected. And that doesn't fit with the uniformitarian assumption that undergirds evolution and geology. And yet, there are 5 mass extinction events that are thought to have occurred over the last 450 million years, according to the evolutionary timescale, where huge percentages of the species on the planet just go extinct by some kind of unknown worldwide catastrophe that they don't have an explanation for. And the Ordovician Extinction, supposedly 445 million years ago, 60 to 70% of the Earth's species are thought to have gone extinct. They don't show up again above those layers. In the Devonian Extinction, up to 75% of the Earth's species disappear from the Earth. The Permian Extinction, 95% of the Earth's species went extinct. In the Triassic Extinction, You have 70 to 80% of the Earth's species disappeared. In the Cretaceous extinction, you have 75% of the Earth's species that go extinct. And the cause of these massive world-affecting extinctions are unknown, although the last one is argued by some to be from a massive meteorite that struck the Earth off the coast of Mexico. The Chicxulub crater was left by that. But again, even if such major worldwide extinction events are true, then catastrophism, not uniformitarianism, fits the geologic evidence. And so evolutionists may not like our particular worldwide extinction event, but they can't very well argue against catastrophism and still believe in 5 worldwide catastrophes and not even know what caused them. I mean, for all they know, it was a global flood. I mean, why are they so adamant against that particular catastrophe when they don't even have an alternative? Well, I think we know why. The fossil record is saturated with evidences of catastrophic conditions being at play in the past. Fossil graveyards, technically called Lagerstätten, are found all over the world throughout the fossil record, where large numbers of animals were buried rapidly by some sort of catastrophic event. I had the opportunity to excavate dinosaur fossils in one of these graveyards in Wyoming, where there was an estimated 5,000 dinosaurs that had been killed, torn to bits, transported some long distance, and then rapidly buried them there in this ranch in Wyoming. So imagine the catastrophic conditions that would be necessary to do that, especially when you're not talking about little dinosaurs, but T-Rex, Edmontosaurus, Triceratops, Pachycephalosaurs, those are all being found there. Polystrate fossils, these are fossils that span more than one strata, are found all over the world as well, from trees and calamites to catfish and even whales. Aspiration fossils have been found where fish died rapidly, choking on their dinner. In a famous ichthyosaur fossil, we find that the enormous sea creature, this ichthyosaur, was killed and buried in the middle of giving birth of a little ichthyosaur coming out there. So many fossils show evidence of rapid burial, catastrophism, as would be expected if the flood happened. While dinosaurs are rarely found articulated, that is, where their bones are together in the positions that they would have been in life, when they are found that way, they're often found in a posture called the epistotonic death posture, with their heads thrown back, their tails curved forward, sometimes their mouths are open as though they're gasping for breath. And this posture is understood by paleontologists to be evidence of death by drowning. Recall our discussion of bioturbation. Distinct layers are rare today since there is little catastrophic conditions occurring. Organisms and roots rework soil and destroy distinctive layers. We do, however, see distinct layering throughout the rock layers of the Paleozoic and Mesozoic, what we would understand to be the flood rock layers. And so the thin layering of rock strata found all over the world is evidence of catastrophic deposition of the geologic column and therefore the fossil record, because bioturbation occurs today under uniform conditions. But it clearly didn't happen in the past since we see distinct layering. So thin layering forms from catastrophic deposition of sediment. Mount St. Helens eruptions have proved that. The distinct unbioturbated rock layers of the Earth are evidence of a totally different condition on the Earth in the past, conditions in which rapid deposition didn't provide enough time for normal bioturbation to occur. Between the mass extinctions found throughout the fossil record and the many fossil examples that require catastrophic conditions, clearly catastrophism is a major characteristic of the fossil record. But how would creationists explain 5 extinction events instead of 1? Well, we'd interpret the same supposed extinction data differently in a way that doesn't cause a dilemma for evolutionists. Are we out of time already? Is that it? We're done? I didn't hear a bell or anything. We're all done, aren't we? Is that it? They're coming. Are you good? Oh, no, I'm not good, but we'll have to be good. I still got another 16 slides to go. So. All right, so I'm going to finish this off tomorrow, and then we're going to jump into the flood itself, and hopefully we won't drown like we did tonight.